There were coaching philosophies, books, clinics, everything written about how to play without the three-point shot. What they miss is that the benefit was so big that you should still be doing it. The shot, literally out of the gate, was worth so much more than 50% more. It's not that hard to figure out. All the reasons why people weren't using it were trumped by how big the reward was.
Hello, and welcome to the Decision Education Podcast, where we talk to experts and share tips on all things related to decision making. I'm your Season 2 guest host, Annie Duke, broadcasting from the Alliance for Decision Education, the educational nonprofit committed to the understanding that better decisions lead to better lives and a better society. In this season, we're turning our attention to decision making in the world of high-performance sports. My hope is that through these conversations, you'll start to think differently about the critical role of decision-making in the competitive sports we follow so passionately, as well as discover practical ways to improve your own decision-making. Imagine what a difference it would make in your life and the lives of those you love if we were all even a little bit better at making decisions. The Alliance is building a national movement to bring decision education to every student in this country. But this podcast is for you, the adults, who are already out in the world making thousands of decisions every day and who want to get better at it. I'm excited to welcome my guest today, Daryl Morey. Daryl Morey is president of basketball operations for the Philadelphia 76ers. Daryl was profiled in Michael Lewis's book, The Undoing Project, and his analytical approach to basketball is often labeled Morey Ball, in reference to Lewis's earlier bestseller, Moneyball. Daryl studied computer science at Northwestern University and has an MBA from MIT Sloan School of Management. His career began with 3 seasons as Senior Vice President of Operations for the Boston Celtics in 2002, and was then followed by 13 seasons as General Manager for the Houston Rockets from 2007 to 2020. The Rockets' 8 straight playoff appearances from 2013 to 2020 represent the longest streak in the NBA at that time. In 2006, Daryl co-founded the MIT Sloan Sports Analytics Conference, an annual event that brings industry professionals and students together to discuss the increasing role of analytics in the sports industry. In 2018, Daryl was named NBA Executive of the Year. Among executives with at least 1,000 games of experience, Morey's record is 5th best in league history. Hi, Daryl. It's so nice for you to come on this podcast. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me, Annie. Appreciate it.
So we got introduced through Michael Mauboussin, who I know you're a huge fan of, and I am a ginormous fan of his as well. So thank you, Michael. But maybe we'll get into a little bit of some of the things that he's written about. And I think we may have a couple of other people in common that you know, Cade Massey.
Of course, yeah.
Richard Thaler.
Yeah, Dick Taylor, yeah.
Weiner.
Dick and Cade wrote the best sports paper ever still, the one on the first pick in the NFL being a bad pick. So
Right, yeah. And I know that I think, didn't Thaler just recently present at the MIT Sports Analytics Conference on just sort of this scratching the head about why the NFL has been so slow to adopt analytics?
Yeah, it was the NFL, but it was more the NBA and how the NBA is pretty far behind. I would say for the audience that might be familiar with blackjack, it would be like if blackjack was not doubling down on 11. Maybe we should double down on 11. Yeah. And then everyone's like, oh, he's so smart. They're doubling down on 11. Yeah. So,
well, wouldn't it be more like nobody doubled down on 11 for years, and then some mathematicians came along or data scientists and said, you really should be doubling down on 11. And then the whole league said, no.
I think you have it more right. They said nah for a long time, and then a few teams started to do it, and then everyone copied. That's right. Yep. They had amazing shooters like Larry Bird, who they'd actively tell to not shoot 3-pointers. So yeah, it was even worse.
Right. So Mauboussin actually just wrote about this, right? And thinking about that in relation to investing. And he was looking at the history of the 3-point shot. So why don't we just start there? If we take something like the 3-point shot, which I think hopefully people can understand this concept of 3 is more than 2.
You'd be surprised, Annie. You'd be surprised.
Right. I think it's such a good example because I've wondered about this. I've talked to a few people from the NBA and kind of asked them the same question is, you're considered one of the key individuals who's brought sports analytics to the game, and you've gotten a competitive advantage from the fact that you understand this stuff and you're willing to be an early adopter of it. When you think about something like the 3-point shot and you have somebody like Larry Bird who clearly could shoot from outside that line, why do you think it is that even though the math was very clear, people weren't doing it? Maybe you could actually just walk a little bit through the math. I mean, 3 is more than 2 is a little bit of a simplification because it depends on the probability you can shoot. But can you sort of walk through why we know that you should be shooting more 3-pointers and how that got adopted within the NBA?
Sure. Yeah, I'll keep the math simple and then I'll go into why, because I think the why is more interesting. But if you just looked at any point in NBA history, although it's starting to converge, and you just said, hey, if you just take all the shots that people took behind the 3-point line and you said, what do they make it at? They make it somewhere between 35 and 40%. And then you take all the shots, away from the rim, but inside the 3-point arc. And you see that league wide that, teams are making about 40% or, a little bit over 40% of those shots. And the math isn't that hard. I wish it was harder. It's really 3 times, 35 to 40% compared to 2 times, low 40s. And that one's bigger. And actually part of it that people miss that even adds to the 3-point shot being worth a lot is that for the same number of points generated, if you go 2 for 6 from 3, you get 6 points. You go 3 for 6 from 2, you also get 6 points. But there's actually one more miss for the offense to try to offensive rebound. So it actually boosts it even more. And the reason people didn't do it is a lot of like psychology more than anything. I to stick with a blackjack example, which I'm going to try here, never having done it before. But imagine, blackjack has been played for, 200 years, no idea, but it's a long time. And, people who are very smart have written books on how to do it and they've got your strategy and everything. And then all of a sudden, next year, casino comes out and say it's Harrah's. It's a big enough casino. It says, you know what? We're going to change it up a little bit. If you hit on 16 or higher and win, we'll pay you triple. People would go like, you probably still shouldn't hit. You're going to lose or whatever. But if you make that benefit, I don't even know how big you need to make the benefit, but if you make it big enough, people should start hitting on that number, even though you're going to lose at a higher rate. That's pretty similar to what happened to the 3-point shot. There were coaching philosophies, books, clinics, everything written about how to play without the 3-point shot. And all the philosophies were based on how to get like the best shot as close to the basket as possible. That makes sense. If every shot is worth 2, getting the most open, close shot to the hoop, that's the right thing. So every coaching clinic, every system was set up to do that. And then all of a sudden they say, well, we're going to make this shot way out here worth 3. All those people who are invested in that culture and how it's done, they go like, it's just a gimmick. Like, of course you'll make a few, but like, you can't systematically do it. What they missed, and they were somewhat right, what they missed is that the benefit was so big that you should still be doing it. And then it took a long time for coaching philosophies to change, player skills to change, to take advantage of this shot. But the shot, like literally out of the gate, was worth so much more than 2, 50% more. It's not that hard to figure out, but that's a lot, that all the reasons why people weren't using it were trumped by how big the reward was.
So I sort of have 2 different questions that I want to ask about this. And the first is, how much do you think asymmetric loss aversion plays into this? So just for the listeners, loss aversion is that we don't like to make choices that carry some great chance of loss, right? So you're talking about a 3-point shot, you're going to miss it like 65% of the time. So that would just be loss aversion, that maybe you would tend to want to take the one that carried a lower risk of loss than a higher risk of loss, even if what we would say the expected value, in other words, the number of points that would make in the long run, might be greater. But then there's also asymmetric loss aversion, which is when we choose a status quo choice, loss aversion isn't triggered as much. In other words, if we usually take a 2-point shot and you miss it, people are like, what could you do? You missed. But if you now do something new, like, there's this new 3-point shot, it's much more in view when that basket is missed and you're much more worried about the miss and you lose sight of the expected value. So, I mean, I don't know if that was too wonky, but
No, everything you said makes sense. I can tell you're a decision science person. You're 100% right that absolutely, if you make a choice that's within, if you're the gazelle in the herd, with the lions and you're in the middle of the herd, you're much less likely to be scrutinized than if you're taking a correct but radical strategy, at least perceived to be radical at the time, but no one else is taking it. Then you have a decent chance of getting tackled by the lion and eaten, even if it was the right approach. And getting tackled and eaten by the lion in this case is like getting fired and getting kicked out of this sport you love and being, someone who makes their livelihood off of it. So all those factors 100% came into play. The other factor that came into play is there are, for the first 3/4 of a basketball game, expected value optimization is the right approach. When you get to the end of the game, you can actually get to win probability maximizing choices that aren't taking the three. If you're ahead, for example, and you're trying to collapse the variance and have less, standard deviation around your point scoring, even if your expected value is slightly lower. And people, if you don't like the 3-point shot, you're going to use those one-off anecdotal times to argue that into the rest of the game. Like, because there are these times when a 2 is better than a 3, that means that, ergo all the time, the 2 can often be better than the 3. And so you'd get arguments like that as well, along with the loss aversion was a factor for sure.
So people are using arguments that in one situation are totally valid. And in order to essentially rationalize the bias, they're bringing it into other situations that are not valid.
Correct. I bet a lot of people are basketball fans who are listening, I hope. Another big one is they'll say, well, when you were giving those stats earlier about the 3-point percentage on average from 3 versus 2, that's just an average. What about if it's the very open shot from 18 feet versus the very guarded shot from 3? That's actually a really good question. It's one of the first ones you should look at. Averages can be super misleading, as you know. You might have a bimodal distribution. You might have all these different distributions that make looking at the average a really dumb thing. Like looking at the average of a basketball team when you have a 5'5" guy and a 7'3" guy, right? The average is not very useful. But it turns out if you dive into that and you say open shot versus guarded 3, it is true that tightens that gap of the advantage, right? The problem is the benefit they applied to the 3 of 50% trumped all that. So essentially they were correct in sort of the direction of their arguments, but they missed that they applied such a massive benefit to the 3 that even when you adjusted for openness and things like that it was still optimal to generally take a lot more 3s.
So the other thing, so remember I said there were sort of 2 ways that my mind was going with this. The other thing that I'm thinking about is a little bit the career risk side, which you mentioned, right? Like the gazelle gets eaten by the lion, and in the NBA, what that means is that you get fired. And I think about some of these radical adoptions of analytics are occurring by people who aren't carrying the same kind of career risk. So I can't remember his name, but the coach in Texas who just didn't have a punter. I think he's now a college coach.
Yes, Kevin Kelly, I think his name is.
Here's someone, he's just coaching high school, right? He's obviously reads some interesting math, comes up with the idea that usually punting is probably not going to be the best choice. You ought to be going for it a lot more on 4th down. Doesn't even have a punter, but he's coaching high school. This isn't, for example, on the NFL stage, right? I think about the difference in Belichick's early career in terms of his hewing to the analytics versus his mid-career. So early in his career, he actually wasn't going for it on 4th down in a lot of situations where you ought to. He was much more risk averse. And then once he got you see this big change once he wins a Super Bowl, and you see him start to really stick to those analytics. But of course, he's not carrying career risk. So just sort of thoughts on that. And then from your perspective, obviously you are a computer scientist. You went to the Sloan Business School at MIT, the Sloan School of Management. So not necessarily like rising up through the ranks of basketball in the same way. So do you feel like that was also an advantage for you in the way that you came into the league and you were thinking about bringing analytics that allowed you to be actually one of the pioneers?
Yeah, I was absolutely very benefited first with with Wick Grousbeck and Steve Pagliuca, the owner of the Celtics, I always came in with a lot of like very senior level support. And anyone listening to this knows how important that is. So I first came in with a lot of support at the Celtics, but my thoughts and the direction I wanted to go were seen as radical. So I was always, with a governor of Danny Ainge, who was a great general manager, but very open. And he would sort of like take the good and throw out what he didn't want, what he thought was too aggressive, whatever. And that was the comfortable thing. And then again, huge senior level support when I was hired at the Rockets. The owner at the time, Leslie Alexander, he basically said, look, I'm sick of all this normal that's going on. I want to be completely radical. You go. Without that, change is extremely difficult. And change is hard even when you have that, as seen by how long these adoptions have come, even with very senior level people, owners saying we want to move in this, and huge incentives, by the way. We're the kind of an industry that should move the quickest to new ideas because the results of our changes on the floor are seen nightly. Like if we take a strategy and put it on the floor and win the game, partially because of that strategy, that's instant feedback that we're moving in the right direction. Whereas most businesses, when they're like trying some new organizational process, it might be 18 months before their supply chain they're working on, delivers some new advantage. Like we see results instantly. So we should see benefits quicker. So our change should be even quicker. But even with all that, the change was slower. And, I think there are bottom-up changes that can happen in industries, but it's generally senior level support and resources along with someone who can execute that makes it happen. And it's sad that it often doesn't happen without that.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's such a good lesson for that, like across your decision-making life, like a really good decision-making environment and support for you to be able to do the right thing from expected value or maximizing win probability is so incredibly important. And one of the things that I think about is like, so how do you deal with, though, that there's the support within the organization itself, but then you have this problem of the demands of the fans. So I think about this in terms of like team building, right? Mm-hmm. So sometimes you got to strip it down in order to build it back up. And then people can be pretty intolerant. Of course, just coming to Philly, that trust the process used to be spit out as an insult by the fans.
Or positive. I think there's a dichotomy there.
No, initially...
Yes.
Initially, it was a compliment. And then, it takes a while, right? And there's some intolerance, and then trust the process was a insult. And then it went back to being a compliment again. But I think there are different time horizons. This is something that Michael Mauboussin has actually talked about as well. There are different time horizons. There's different time horizons for what the fans want. There are different time horizons for what the owner wants. There's different time horizons for what the GM wants. There's different time horizons for what the coach wants. And that's creating a lot of friction, right? How do you then, as someone who's managing a team or making these kinds of decisions, allow yourself to then still make the right decisions? How are you thinking about this balance? Are you even thinking about that balance of the different time horizons? And how do you deal with the fallout when the outcome just goes one way that doesn't look great for you?
Yeah, I'll start with, to your point on when you're making decisions to be a little bit out of the norm and be aggressive. And I won't say specifically, we just had one in Philadelphia where we took a step back and said, hey, let's be more aggressive in area X. I spent a lot of time saying like, okay, everyone in this room, we're all together. We're going to take this more aggressive approach. It also means that we're going to fail probably at a much higher rate than before. And we can't be freaking out the first 1, 2, 3 times things don't work out. And that's an important thing for the senior leadership like myself and Doc to set that tone that like, hey, we're taking this thing as a collective. And when it goes bad, you're going to be able to blame Daryl. And if it goes well, it's going to be a collective decision, both to your coach and then also ownership that like, hey, we need to take this bet because the alternative, and it's always important to look at your alternative. Our alternative is a lower odds to win the title. We might maybe have a higher expected value, but we have to be the best of 30. So if you have to be the best out of 30, by definition, you have to inject more variance into your system. You have to take bigger bets. The more if it's the Ricky Bobby of the NBA, if you ain't first, you're last, you have to inject more variance into your system all the time. In fact, no team even injects enough. Like if you actually take the actual math of the NBA, teams should be doing radical things constantly because they're just trying to be the best out of 30. You don't actually see that behavior, however.
Do you know what's so funny is that, so I hadn't really considered that in relation to the NBA, but that's a total poker concept. So there are two different types of tournaments you can play. One where there are graduated payouts. So, first place might get like 40% of the prize pool, and second place gets 20%, and third place gets 10%. And then there's sort of dribbles all the way down so that the top 10% of people who finish in the tournament will get some money. And if you're like right on the bubble and you just cash, you might get your money back, right? So obviously you're still motivated to come in first place, but it's not like you get nothing for the other places. And that actually changes how much variance you're willing to take on at different points in the tournament. But for a winner take all tournament, now you can kind of think about it this way, that in a graduated tournament, there are certain points where you might take like a 51-49 favorite for yourself because the variance is too high. It's too high volatility. And if you're out, you're out, right? So you don't want to do that in certain situations. But in a winner take all, you would do that every single time. You have to take on that volatility because there's no point in getting the second most chips. It does not help you.
100%. And actually, I just did I'm bad at poker. I'm
very bad at anything to do with basketball.
I'm fairly intuitive with probabilities, but I ended up in a poker after dark, which I think you maybe did the first one ever or something like that.
I might have a long time ago.
So I was in it, and I was in it with Scott Blumstein, former World Series poker champion, Maria Ho, Nate Silver, who I think is like on his way to doing really well at the World Series of Poker right now. And so I consciously knew I was worse than them, but it was a winner take all. So you'll see, like, I think this episode's coming out. You'll see me going all in all the time, like probably even overly risky. But I figured my only chance was to get a huge stack against, there's maybe one player there who is worse than me, according to Scott and those guys who really knew every player at the table. And so I was actively trying to take all his chips because I figured I had no shot against anyone else. And I was going all in all the time. I at least rationalized it in my head as like, okay, this is my only shot at beating these amazing pros that I'm like absolutely at a disadvantage to.
Well, so I have a famous story of that strategy, just as like a side note. I was in the NBC Heads Up National Championship and I was in the finals. So it's just me and one other player. And that other player was Eric Seidel, who, for people who don't know, is like a 9-time world champion at the World Series of Poker. And like he's won like 40-something million playing poker. He's amazing. Right. He also happened to be like my mentor. So you play 3 heads up matches to determine. So it's the best of 3. So we played the first one and I actually beat him pretty soundly because he didn't quite have my pattern down yet, like what the things are that I did. But we came back for the second match and it was like he had spent the time sort of unlocking my style and just wiped the table with me. So I go into the third match and I did what you did. I said, okay, I have a problem because as fast as I can adjust to what he's doing, he's going to adjust faster to me because he's just a much better player than I am. So I said, I'm just going to look for an opportunity to get all my chips in. And I would rather get all my chips in 40% to win, then try to make hundreds of small decisions where he's maybe 55-45 or 52-48, where over those hundreds of decisions, I'm guaranteed to lose. I'd rather just take my chances one time. So I did that and I won the thing.
Yes, that's awesome. And is it similar to when you get short stacked and one of those things, you just go all in, even if you're, because otherwise, you're going to get ground.
It doesn't really help you to win. Yeah, you need to be able to play a handout. Like you can't get to real decision making if you can't actually play a handout. So you need to actually try as much as you can to say to the person that you're playing against, I can damage you. So it still gives you a little bit of power. So anyway, that's so funny. Anyway, we should move on. So what I'd love to understand is as you're thinking about these trades, what is your process? And then how are you thinking about, because there is obviously variance. What does the likelihood that person actually does become a star have to be? Or does, how does that go into the equation?
Sure. It depends on where your team's at. So if you're a team that already has like some foundational pieces, you essentially are trying to, it's a different optimization once you have like your first foundational piece. Then it becomes like getting 5% edges can make a real difference, right? Can actually move you from, being like last year where we were one of the final teams standing, but not quite good enough to win it. If we could take our team last year and add 5 or 10%, that might be enough to win the title. But if we were a different team, we were a team out of the playoffs, doing these incremental moves doesn't do a whole lot, if that makes sense.
Oh yeah, no, that would you relate that in terms of the NFL to? There's going to be a lot of it's high risk. There's a lot of stuff that can go wrong, but high reward in terms of the quarterback. But if you can get that quarterback, and you're going to have a lot of misses because it is high volatility. But if you can get them in place, then you can start to make a lot more low volatility sort of team building around that person. Would you say that that's a similar way?
Yeah, I'm not an expert in the NFL, but that seems very similar. I do know there's only been a very small number of Super Bowls won by what people would consider an average or below average quarterback. It shows like how critical that position is. And what's really tough for NFL team building, at least as far as I know, generally the prediction rate on which quarterbacks are going to be good has been very low. So you have this thing you have to get to have a chance to win, but at the same time, by definition, is high variance coming out of the draft. There have been, I know, and this was Dick Taylor and Cade Macy's paper from way back when, I think the fail rate on succeeding in picking quarterbacks might be the lowest of all the rates. Some level it makes sense because you're a crucible into one, whereas if you're a wide receiver, you have more chances to get on the field. But some of it's just like they're very hard to predict.
Yeah, that's so interesting. So I hadn't really thought about it that way. So you think about it as I want to get that anchor player and then build around them. And then I assume when you're building around them, sometimes you get lucky.
It doesn't happen too often. In fact, it's happened to opponents of mine, and it's really frustrating when it does happen. When, Golden State sort of famously won 73 games and then added the best free agents in the offseason because of there was a windfall of money that came into the league. And so that was super frustrating.
Well, I'm just thinking about, because obviously you were with the Celtics. So I grew up in New Hampshire. So I grew up watching the Celtics. And I just think about the Celtics when I was growing up. And, obviously Larry Bird was amazing, but it's not like Kevin McHale was a slouch. Or Robert Parrish.
Or DJ, or you can Danny Ainge. I mean, that was that Bill Walton. I mean, they
and then even there you had John Havlicek as the sixth man. Like that was pretty good.
Well, Havlicek was before
a little before, but like that was as they were building into that, right?
Oh, right, yeah. So you're right. He was the sixth man on another great team, with JoJo White. I mean, you can keep going, right? So yeah. No, the Celtics. Now, there was no accident, as far as I know, because I got this incredibly lucky chance to work with Red Auerbach, very limited, because he was very old when I worked with him at the Celtics. But the one thing I learned in my very brief interactions with the Celtics was that it was no accident the Celtics were good consistently. It was because, as far as I could tell, Red Auerbach was an innovator for years and years and years and ahead of his time. Picking Larry Bird by drafting a year early before they changed the rules. Frankly, in these sports and places where the playing field is pretty level, taking advantage of the rules that aren't in place yet or are in place, but you take advantage of them more than others, is actually a more robust strategy than quite a few other strategies, because it's very tough to get an advantage when 30 pretty intelligent organizations are all competing with each other.
Well, I would imagine that's a place where really being deep in the analytics can be helpful, because if there's a rule change, I imagine understanding what the consequences of that rule are, unintended or otherwise, right? How that might change the structure of the team in general. Being able to see what that impact might be and being able to forecast better than other teams is then going to open up an advantage for you.
It's a huge advantage. The NBA is going through it right now. It's early. We're only 5 or so games into the season for the league, but the interpretation on a lot of the league has changed pretty radically from my eyes. The data is too early to really say is the change fundamental or not. But from my eyes, baseball went through it. Their ball will change radically from year to year. And I don't even think it's on purpose. I think it's just slight changes in the manufacturing, even unintentional, can really change Major League Baseball. So these we had a change in the NBA where all of a sudden in 2007, I believe, you could no longer like literally touch a player on the perimeter without it being a foul. And that radically changed the league. So you're right. Being able to rapidly adapt to these rule changes becomes a big factor.
So I'm just thinking about something in basketball. Like we're talking about like this idea of how might a rule change or the change in the ball or something impact things in a way where you can see it in a way that other people don't see, right? Like I think this is such an important concept for gaining an advantage in decision making. So when you think about decisions in basketball, is there any that you can point to that are much more important or impactful that people don't realize? Not necessarily like maybe executives within the NBA, but even, fans who are watching the game, they don't even understand how important those decisions are.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I would say, a big one that's maybe not seen is I mean, I think fans see it, but they don't know how important it is the pace of play. So because two teams are playing each other, and let's say it's a Tuesday, it's two, like a good team playing a bad team where the good team's likely at 85% odds to win. One's played a back-to-back, one's played a bunch of games, and they're playing each other. If you're just looking at the score, it'll actually look like a very similar score to a game that you might see in a playoffs, like 101 to 98, whatever. But the immediate thing that we can see when we watch the game is like the energy level, the effort, how hard it is for someone to beat someone on their first move. Like all these things pop out immediately. And you can tell like, hey, both teams are sort of mailing it in tonight. Whereas the casual fan, if both teams are mailing it in, it sort of cancels out and they can't really tell, right? They're like, oh, he got to the basket, but yeah, on one night it could be an amazing move. He beat a good defender. On another night, a guy getting to the basket can just be like, both guys are tired and the defender was just lazy. And I'll be able to pick those up, whereas someone else won't potentially.
So when one team is like clearly really good, they're kind of taking the night off because they want to save their energy, like for when they're playing someone who's closer in skill. And when the team's really bad, they're also kind of taking the night off because they know they can't win anyway.
Yeah, in some levels, it's not necessarily conscious.
Right,
it's a lot of like human psychology in that, we know like, humans are very good when there's a rush of adrenaline and things like that. And if you're playing a team that you sort of expect to beat, you don't come in with the same level of like, this possession is the one I'm going to win. Yeah. And so that happens a lot in every sport. I think in the NBA, it's even more pronounced, given the number of games we play, the amount of minutes our players are expected to play. You definitely get like a dragged out back-to-back, game between a great team and a worse team that, isn't as high quality a game for someone who watches it for a living.
So it's funny because when you said pacing, I actually thought of something that's been on my mind that I've always thought, I wonder if this is kind of a nutty thought. So when we were talking about this match that I played against Eric Seidel, or what you were doing in the Poker After Dark, which was a correct thing for you to do, you were essentially trying to reduce the number of decisions that you had to make against people who were going to be better at decision making than you were. So this is like a very simple concept. If you force me to flip an unfair coin, I should want to only flip once. If we're like betting $10 on it and I have to do it, I have to do it and I get to choose how many times, but it has to be at least once. I should want to do it only once. But if on the good side of that flip, I want to do it 100 times.
Correct.
Right.
Yeah.
So I've wondered about this in sports, whether it's NFL or NBA. If you know that you have an advantage over the team that you're playing, do you speed up play at least? I know at the end of the game, there's things that happen that are going to distort this, but do you go in consciously trying to speed up play so you're getting as many touches of the ball as you possibly can? And vice versa, actually. That's always been a nutty thought I've had in my head.
No, it's a thought that, teams don't think as intentionally about that as they should. I would say the reason it hasn't come up in the NBA is that playing at a higher pace confers an advantage to the team that plays at it. If you play 4-on-4 or 3-on-3, that the offense has an advantage more than in 5-on-5, or if somehow we were to play 6-on-6, the offense would get hurt more than the defense. So the offense gets hurt more than the defense. And so if you're the better team, you want to play at a higher pace to get more back and forth, 100%. But you also want to play at a higher pace because it's actually just better. And it's also true the other direction. it's sort of interesting. If the other team is a lot better than you should, before they had a shot clock, that's why you saw four corners offense and things like that. In theory, before there was a shot clock, if you're the worst team, you literally should just like not try the whole, like just play keep away if you can. No, you can't. And then take one shot. Like,
right.
And it would be
one
the worst thing to watch ever.
One flip of the coin, just see what happens.
I'm actually shocked high school basketball isn't like this, because most high schools can't afford a shot clock or it's not implemented in their leagues. High school basketball should be absolutely awful if they were just trying to optimize winning. Now, we know that there's more things to high school basketball than just winning a game.
You're getting scouted and
maybe nobody was like entertainment, all these things. But the reality is the worst team should always just hold the ball the whole quarter. If they can. Now, often you can press and trap and things like that. But in theory, if you could just take one shot per quarter, that would be ideal, obviously.
Yeah. I mean, I love the way this conceptually crosses so many different things, right? This idea of how good am I? And then the second question, how much variance do I want to bring into the situation? Do I want one coin flip or do I want 100? And this is generally a decision-making framework. Like, it's a good mental model to apply to decision-making. It, of course, obviously takes some humility, because you have to recognize, like, Eric Seidel's way better than me. He's just going to crush me.
Right.
So
I find poker, there are a lot of poker players in professional sports. I find them to be very good at, they just intuitively get these risk reward variance, payouts, bet sizing, all this kinds of things. So poker is, and I think you've written about it, like probably one of the best games as a framework for life decisions and things like that. Obviously, life decisions.
Hopefully, I wrote a whole book on that premise. So
yes, exactly. So I'm preaching to the choir.
Yeah.
Buy Annie's book.
Well, thank you. So I cannot get away without asking you about Ben Simmons.
Sure.
Because my brother relentlessly pings my husband, who is he has been a Sixers fan since 1982, my husband. So he says, oh, this is what it's always this. He's in, he's out, he's in, he's out. So I'm just curious, how's that going for you? Do you have, how are you thinking about his future with the 76ers? And actually, I mean, not just in terms of, trying to get some inside info here, but this is a decision that's receiving tremendous attention as you're making it. And I'm just wondering, like, how that also affects your decision-making also.
Yeah, I think if I was earlier in my career, the last part you asked about would have been more challenging. I think in this case, like the approach we need to take, to me, is so obvious that you're going to be comfortable with the criticism. I think, just like in poker, you get to the final table with Eric and you made the plus EV bet against him, even adjusting for his form, how he plays and you play, and you make it. I would hope that you're going to go back and sleep that night and be like, hey, I took the right play. It just didn't work out. Right. And so I think we're at that place where we know Ben Simmons is an extremely good player. We know he's, someone who committed to the 76ers for 5 years and has 4 more years. We know that he brings elite defense, and to talk of pace, he brings pace to the game. And actually early returns in the season, those are the two areas where we're struggling the most relative to the past. No surprise, given how elite Ben is at those two things. And so we know that our job is to win the title, and we know that Ben Simmons makes us a much better team to win it. So when you get into a situation with a player who wants to leave, right, we have to focus on the 76ers. Now, we do care about Ben Simmons, but my first job is to the Philadelphia 76ers and their fans.
All right, I'm going to go let my husband know that answer. He's very, very interested in this.
Well, I think there's more than just he who's interested.
I know. So. He's a representative of all of Philadelphia, though. No.
Yes, which is Philadelphia fan. I love it. Actually, it just reminds me. I grew up in Cleveland, and so the fans here remind me so much of Cleveland. Hopefully, I'm not insulting Philly fans, but I didn't grow up here, so I can only compare to Cleveland Browns fans who are very passionate, let you know when they don't agree.
Well, as you know, Philly is known to boo its own teams. So
they do, and that's unique. But I mean, I think it comes from a place of love, though, where they're trying to push the team to a higher level of play. So I appreciate it.
Philly fans are passionate and they stick with the teams. They are not fair weather fans. So I agree with you. I think when they're booing, it's like, come on, like we want to win because we're never going to leave you. So
Correct.
I think that's
right.
true. I suffered through like Buddy Ryan at the Eagles a long time ago. So just to wrap up, this has been so amazing. I want to just wrap up with a couple things. So obviously you have such an incredible varied background that you've taken. I'm thinking with you of something like David Epstein's Range, right? Like you take all these different perspectives and backgrounds and you like bring them into something new and you just like, it helps you to succeed, right? And so for people who don't know, Range is, why generalists thrive in a specialist world. Amazing book. People should check it out. But let me ask you, what book would you recommend for listeners who really want to improve their decision-making?
Well, I would say probably that's such a good question. I'm going to send you a list of books because I've done that before, so you can put it on your site. I only get one book. I do think, Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast, is probably the best. And I like the greatest thing ever just happened with Daniel Kahneman, which was he basically said, one of the chapters of his book isn't right anymore, which you see so little of. Like it shows how great he is that he's updating his beliefs as new information comes in. As anyone who's written a book, which I have, and you've done multiple, that like there's stuff you're like, oh man, I wish I could rewrite that chapter because we got all this new research and stuff. And so the fact that Daniel Kahneman isn't a zealot and saying like, hey, the rough frameworks that were the foundations of behavioral economics and decision science are right, but we've been wrong here. And this is where we're updating. That just shows, why he's so important. So I would read the whole book. I would also read his recent, hey, I think it was it actually loss aversion? I know loss of priming, but loss aversion has had a ton of stuff too. And in fact, again, poker players or blackjack players would know where loss aversion was wrong. So a lot of the early studies on loss aversion were not taking risk of ruin into account. So they weren't taking Kelly criterion. And it turns out humans often are a little more rational than people think. Again, we screw things up a lot too, but that essentially humans were using like probably a crude or bad heuristic version of Kelly criterion in a lot of their loss aversion. And when you adjust for that, it's not quite as bad as some of the original research. Yeah.
So what Kahneman talks about now, I think, which is super interesting related to loss aversion, is what he's termed sure loss aversion. Sort of deals with that. You lose this problem. And this is this problem. You owe me $100. Do you want to flip a coin, double or nothing? Or I owe you $100. Do you want to flip a coin, double or nothing? Now, those are identical propositions. They both, if you flip a coin, double or nothing for $100 gain, the expected value is $100. Vice versa. If you do it on the loss side, the expected value is a loss of $100. What happens is that on the gain side, people say no. They want to bring the volatility to zero and take the gain. But on the loss side, they say yes to that. And they want to gamble for it. Now, what's interesting, because they don't want to turn a paper loss into a realized loss. So that's why it's called sure loss aversion. I don't want to turn it into a sure loss.
Makes sense.
What's super interesting is that if I say to you, I owe you $100, do you want to flip a coin, 220 or zero? I know Daryl Morey is going to say yes, but most people will say no. So they're giving up $10, right? But if I say, you owe me $100, do you want to flip a coin, negative 220 or zero? Daryl Morey is certainly going to say no, because you're not going to pay me $10 for the opportunity. But most people will say yes. That's how strong sure loss aversion is. So this gets rid of this Kelly criterion problem.
Oh, interesting. You're like one step past me. I'm learning something. This is great.
There you go. All right.
The one I would tell you before is the hot streaks have also been updated in that they had the math wrong. And then they had another thing wrong. We knew hot streaks existed, but people still think the effect is way bigger than it is. But we knew they existed just from the second free throw always had a slightly high percentage. There's a whole muscle memory aspect to it. And mostly why hot streaks didn't exist were A, they had the math wrong, and B, people were taking much harder shots. They're like, oh, I'm hot, so I'll just take really hard stuff. So it'd be like if you had an 11, you got a 10, 21, oh, I'm hot, I'm going to hit on 15 now. So, And, of course, in blackjack, there is no hot streaks, let's be clear. But in the sports where there is a physical element, especially where there's muscle memory involved, there has been pretty much proven that there's these slight hot streak effects. So,
yeah, I've always thought about that also, just like in terms of poker. And I think about that with even football and basketball, is that it's an interaction of other people with you as well. So if you're perceived to be hot, so in poker, you'll call it a rush as opposed to a hot streak. If you're perceived to be hot, then people actually think they attribute to you a stronger hand than you actually have. It makes it easier to bluff. And the easier it is to bluff, the more likely you're going to win, because bluffing is a very key component of the game. So it kind of becomes self-generating, because once they perceive that you're lucky, then people's behavior.
Does that even work on pros, or do pros not have that effect?
I think there's some subconscious, I don't want to get in that person's way, they're winning every hand kind of thing that goes on. I hope I'm not susceptible to it, but I bet you I was. I would put a bet on it, because that's the way the mind works. One last question. So I agree with you. Thinking Fast and Slow, if I had to choose one, would be the one that I would choose. I always throw in Michael's book, The Success Equation.
Good ones. Which one?
The Success Equation, on the influence of luck and skill, because I just think it's so interesting to understand, like, how are luck and skill influencing your life? How do you think about those two different things? And then I've just got to give a plug for Phil Tetlock's Super Forecasting.
I love Super Forecasting. Oh my God. I think he lives in Brooklyn. He lives close by too.
No, Phil's a Philly guy.
Is he Philly? Does he live in Philly?
He's at University of Pennsylvania. You know why? I work in his lab. I know.
Wow.
With Barb Mellor.
Yeah, no, I actually think Super Forecasting was a big breakthrough. And the one I read cover to cover most intensely when it came out in the last 10 years. What, did that come out 5 years ago now? So, or maybe 6.
No, I think it was probably like 6 or 7. It was a while ago. Yeah, it's such a good book.
So good. Yeah.
Last question. What decision-making tool or idea or strategy would you want to pass down to the next generation of decision makers?
I would say probably the main thing, especially if you get into a leadership role, is to make sure you're hanging back on your opinions before you ask people their opinions. That's probably the number one. Like, even people who are experienced and brave decision makers, if they're not the final, once they hear the direction the lead person is going, they can't help but line up sort of behind that. So
you are a man after my own heart. I have a line in How to Decide, which is, if you want to know what someone thinks, don't tell them what you think first.
100%. You can't. You have to catch yourself, because often you feel like you know the answer. And on small decisions that don't matter, sometimes for speed, I'll just be like, hey, if anyone disagrees. But for big ones, it's very important that you create a space to allow people to disagree. So
yeah. So one trick that I use, if you want to steal it, is I think about what's the feedback that I'm trying to get from the group, and actually send it out to them in advance of the meeting and have them answer it to me asynchronously.
That's great. Yeah.
Because I can withhold my opinion, but as soon as person A speaks, they're already influencing everybody else. So, and also it helps my thinking, because I'm thinking about what is the feedback that I need here. Send that out, and then I bring that together, and everybody gets to examine it before any discussion, and then really reduces cross-contamination. So I'll pass that on to you. If listeners want to go online and learn more about your work or follow you on social media, where should they start?
Probably just twitter.com. I'm D Morey. I'm pretty easy, and I'll tweet out a lot of nonsense, but hopefully some good stuff as well. It's probably the main place to go.
All right. Well, I follow you. You're a good follow. I like your nonsense. And then for listeners interested in following up on any of the materials mentioned today, check out the show notes on the Alliance site, where you'll also find a transcript of today's conversation. So Daryl, for people who don't know, Daryl and I are 1 day apart on our birthday. So it felt a mind meld before we even started talking. I am so appreciative. I know how incredibly busy you are. You're obviously in the middle of everything. And I'm so appreciative of you joining and having this really cool conversation with me. Thank you.
Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it, Annie. Thanks.
At the Alliance for Decision Education, our mission is to improve lives by empowering students with essential decision skills. We're building a national movement to ensure decision education is part of every student's learning experience. Through this podcast, we're raising awareness about the movement, but we need your help. Please share, tweet, and sign the pledge on our website, alliancefordecisioneducation.org. If there's someone you think would be great for us to interview for a future episode, or if you have a question about decision making that you'd like us to explore on the podcast, email us at connect@alliancefordecisioneducation.org. For listeners interested in following up on any of the materials mentioned today, check out the show notes on the Alliance site, where you'll also find a transcript of today's conversation. Ratings on Apple Podcasts are always greatly appreciated, and don't forget to subscribe to the podcast in your favorite app so that you don't miss an episode. Thank you, and I hope you join us again soon.